Welcome to LFPL's At the Library series, an ongoing podcast featuring author talks, programs, and events at the Louisville Free Public Library. For more information about upcoming events, visit us online at www.lfpl.org/upcoming events.
Dr. Lee Dugatkin is an evolutionary biologist and historian of science in the Department of Biology at the University of Louisville. He's presented at more than 175 venues around the world, including, and there's a long list here, so I'm going to abbreviate it, New Zealand, Australia, Mongolia, Cuba, Russia, Romania, Turkey, Czech Republic, Croatia, Taiwan, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and many more. He is the author of 15 books and more than 200 articles in such journals as Nature, the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences, the Proceedings of the Royal Society of London, and is a contributing author to Scientific American, The American Scientist, The New Scientist, and The Washington Post. Please, if you would, welcome Dr. Lee Dugatkin.
Thank you. Thank you, Tony, for the nice introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming out on a hot summer evening to hear some science. It warms the cockles of my heart that people are willing to do that. And so I've been looking forward to this very much. And I will say, even before I get going, when I'm finished tonight, we still have 3 more lectures, so when I'm finished tonight, I would love it if people would just come up to me and tell me if they felt like this was too detailed, if it wasn't detailed enough, any kind of feedback that I can get so I can build it into the next 3 weeks. And so this is a mini course on evolution. I'm going to try and touch on 4 major topics. There are many, many more. And I start with this quote here, which probably doesn't surprise you to know that evolutionary biologists love. This was by a rather famous geneticist, Dugatkin, who wrote in actually a popular science magazine that nothing in biology makes any sense except in the light of evolution. And so what Dugatkin is not saying is that nothing in biology, nothing in science is of any use except in the light of evolutionary biology. He certainly wasn't saying that. What he was trying to say was that evolutionary biology was the glue that basically joined together all the different sections of biology in a way that no other field had or has. And so I'm going to start with some basic definitions. So if we ask, what is evolution? If we're looking for a kind of dictionary level response, one thing you will often see is just 3 words. Evolution is descent with modification. And by descent, all we mean is that all living forms today and all forms that have ever lived throughout the last 3.8 or so billion years are descended from one or a very few number of original life forms. And one thing that evolutionary biologists do is track the descent from those original life forms down to what we have now. The modification part of descent with modification deals with natural selection, and that's the focus of what we're going to talk about. The process that produces, I'm sorry, this is already dropped out of my ear. Let me see here. I think I've got it. Hang on. There we go. Okay. Just give me a second here, and I'll put it underneath my glasses and not too close to my mouth. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay, very good, very good. So natural selection is the process that has produced the astounding array of different characteristics and traits that we see in all of the organisms living today and that have ever lived. And the aim of evolutionary biologists is rather grand. It's to understand the history and diversity of life. Right now on Earth, we'll see. how it goes. One way to think of evolutionary biology is in terms of what's known as a paradigm shift. So there was a book written long ago called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and it's very famous within kind of philosophical circles. It was written by a fellow by the name of Thomas Kuhn. And Kuhn proposed that major advances in science were really quite rare, that things tended to build up incrementally. Right? But every once in a while, there would be a true scientific revolution. And the way that Kuhn talked about that was something that fundamentally changed the way that we thought about everything. We never think about things the same after this kind of what he refers to as a paradigm shift or a scientific revolution takes place. So a great example of this is when, long ago, we realized that the Earth was not the center of the solar system, that everything did not revolve around us. That fundamentally changed everything about the way we thought before. And what I'm going to argue for the next 3 and 4 weeks is that evolutionary biology, when Darwin proposed it, was a paradigm shift. It aimed to explain the history and descent of life on the planet. This made people think about themselves and everything around them differently than they had before. The approach that we're going to take to studying evolutionary biology is the scientific method. So like every scientist, evolutionary biologists use this scientific method. So we could have an entire hour and a half on the scientific method, but I'm going to basically summarize it, capture it with 2 points. What the scientific method does is it involves generating hypotheses. The thing about hypotheses, for them to be scientific, is that they must be testable. There has to be a way for you, in principle, to test the hypothesis that you're putting out there. So I could hypothesize that a small green teapot that's orbiting around Pluto is controlling everything that happens on the planet Earth. But right now, we have no means of testing that sort of hypothesis, and so it's not a scientific hypothesis. Maybe one day we will be able to detect something as small as a teapot orbiting Pluto, and then maybe we can test it, but not now. It's not testable now. The other thing, and this is extraordinarily important to the scientific method, is that hypotheses have to be falsifiable. There has to be, in principle, evidence that would make you reject your hypothesis. If it's not falsifiable, it's not scientific. And we're going to take this method and we're going to apply it to evolutionary biology. And sort of the vehicle that we're going to use to do that is what's known as methodological naturalism, which simply means that we are going to try and explain the world around us based solely on natural phenomena using this scientific method. So we're not interested in evolutionary biology in supernatural phenomena. We're interested in natural phenomena. Okay? So a quick overview of what we're going to do for the next 4 weeks. Today I'm going to give you an overview of natural selection in operation. We'll start back when Darwin first proposed this, and then relatively quickly we're going to move into a series of really fascinating experiments on natural selection that people have done in everything from mice to E. coli to birds. Next week, we'll focus on this question of species. How do we get new species? How do we lose species? In evolutionary biology, this is speciation and extinction. The third week, we'll focus on the evolution of behavior, which is my own research area, so I'm always excited to talk about this. And then finally, we're going to spend 90 minutes discussing evolution and medicine, what's known as evolutionary medicine or Darwinian medicine. Okay, so Let's start thinking about natural selection. And to do that, we need to go back to 1859, when Darwin published The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. If you poll scientists, they will tell you that along with Newton's Principia, this is the most important book that has ever been written in science. And it's in here that Darwin, among other things, discusses this process of natural selection. I remember when I was a grad student just starting, I felt like reading this book was going to be a very daunting experience. In fact, it's not. It's a very, very readable book. And one of the things that Darwin does throughout the book that I found so refreshing was that he takes time often to stop and say, here are some of the problems I have with these ideas that I'm discussing with you. And we'll talk about those problems a little bit along the way as well. Now, almost everyone's heard of The Origin of Species. Not as many people have heard about Darwin's second most famous book. Came out 12 years later in 1871. And it's really two books that he kind of just pasted together. The book is called The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. So The Descent of Man is Darwin taking the ideas that he developed in The Origin of Species and applying them to humans. He only briefly touches on this towards the end of The Origin of Species. Here is where he discusses the evolution of humans. And in the second part of the book, Selection in Relation to Sex, this is all about how animals choose their mates and their reproductive systems and all of that. We're going to focus mostly on The Origin of Species. And in there, Darwin proposes what he calls two laws. I'm not thrilled with the use of the word law here, but that's what he uses. And these two great laws, the first of which is that the environment selects upon variation in the traits of individual organisms. And we'll get into this in a lot more detail within the next 5 minutes. So the environment, nature, favors certain characteristics in organisms over other characteristics. Some variants, for example, dark fur versus light fur in some species, thick bone structure versus thin bones in another. Some variants have higher reproductive success than others. And those variants with the highest rates of reproduction increase in frequency. And in a nutshell, that's what natural selection is. There's variation in almost all the traits that we see out in nature. So if you were just to look around this room at humans, and you pick any characteristic that we have, almost, right, you will find variation. Look at eye color, hair color, height, weight, almost anything has variation. If that variation translates into differential reproductive success, then some variants are chosen over others. And that is natural selection in a nutshell. So when Darwin talks about the environment selecting on these organisms, what he means is both the living and non-living components of the environment. So what makes one variant of a trait, dark color versus light colored fur, lead to higher reproduction? Well, it depends on the organic, the living component of the world that this organism lives in. Does the color make them more or less susceptible to be taken by predators? Right? Does it allow them to be more or less attractive to the opposite sex? But it also depends upon non-living, that is, inorganic components. So many traits, for example, in plants will depend on how much salt is in the soil, right? Or how much other chemical is in the soil. That will determine whether or not one characteristic in a plant species is favored over another. So the environment sets the stage on which natural selection operates. What that means is that selection explains two different but very important phenomena. how characteristics of organisms change over time. It may be that at different times in history, light-colored fur was favored over dark-colored fur, and at other times, dark-colored fur was favored over light-colored fur, or the ability to smell certain substances in the environment to hunt down food was favored over certain other olfactory or visual senses. But it not only explains the characteristics of organisms and how they change, but it explains why organisms, generally speaking, are extremely well-suited to live in their environments. So here's a quote from Darwin on this process of natural selection. It works by either now adapting the varying parts of each being to its inorganic and organic conditions of life. What kind of predators does it have? What's the inorganic environment like? Or having adapted them during some period in the past. I said that there were these two great laws. The second great law is the common ancestry of living things, that all species have descended from one or a few common ancestors. And what that allows us to do is understand, for example, why different species are similar to one another or different from one another. Right? All squirrels have descended from some ancestral squirrel-like organism in the past. And all horses have descended from some ancestral horse-like organism in the past. Because they've descended from two different ancestors in recent time, what that means is we understand now, why does a 13-line squirrel look more like a gray squirrel than it looks like a horse? And the reason is they have a shared common ancestor. Why does one species of horse look different from another? Why does it look but if you compare it to a squirrel, it looks dramatically different because horses have shared a common ancestor in relatively recent time that's different from that of the squirrels. We are not going to spend a lot of time on this second law. We could have an entire series of lectures on this. Within evolutionary biology, studying common ancestry is known by this technical term phylogenetics, and we could have an entire 4-week lecture on phylogenetics, but we are going to focus on natural selection, both tonight, and then it's going to sort of be embedded in the other lectures. And so just a little bit more history before we get to some modern examples of applying these ideas and studying them. So if you look at the origin of species, there was not just a table of contents where you had, say, chapter 1, which was titled Variation on Domestication, but in the 1850s, it was very common to have sort of a sub-table of contents. So when you first opened up chapter 1, or even in the table of contents, you would see that chapter 1 is going to talk about all these different things. Right? And I've highlighted one of them right here, which is domesticated pigeons. Darwin was fairly obsessed on domesticated pigeons. And when I was a grad student first getting interested in this, I was sort of taken aback. I thought, well, here's the most important book, certainly within biology. And here's Darwin, page after page, talking about domestic pigeons. Why? The reason he's doing this is he's essentially setting up his readers. So what he's going to do, and what we're going to do just for 2 minutes now, is walk through a process that everyone in Darwin's time would have understood very, very well and accepted without reservation. And then what Darwin is going to do, and this is why he's setting them up, is he's going to say, if you understand this and accept it without reservation, then the idea I'm going to tell you is essentially the same thing at just a different level, and you should view this and think about this in the same way that you think about that thing which is so common and familiar to you. And the way he's going to do this is through domesticated pigeons. So there is this process that's called artificial selection. And artificial selection is very easy to understand. We do it all the time. Right? What artificial selection is humans are going to select for certain characteristics in organisms that we want to see more of in those organisms. So, for example, we might select chickens that produce more eggs, or horses that are faster, dogs that are hunting dogs, dogs that are herding dogs. How do you do it? Well, Darwin's going to explain it, and he's going to use domestic pigeons as an example. And the reason he does this is that not only Darwin, but Victorian England in general was just obsessed with pigeon breeding. Right? There were all sorts of beautiful, extraordinary pigeon variants besides this street pigeon that you can see out here, known as the rock pigeon. But all of those variants are the result of artificial selection on this rock pigeon type. Everything. So Darwin is going to discuss things like, well, how do you go from here to here? And this is a snow white, I don't know the technical name for it, they probably have one, variety of pigeon. Here's the equivalent, but with this beautiful, dark, shiny plumage. And here's a more rock pigeon-like bird, but it has this extraordinary tail that you don't see on a normal pigeon. All of this has occurred through the process of artificial selection, and Darwin's going to explain it. Right? And so he's going to explain it like this. You go out, you catch a bunch of these things, hundreds if you want. Okay? And then when you look at them, you determine what it is that you want to try and produce. So let's say you want to produce, at the end of everything you're going to do, this beautiful snow white feathered pigeon. Well, rock pigeons have, naturally have little bits of white in their feathers. Okay? So what do? You go into the hundreds of pigeons that you have, and you pick the ones that have the most white plumage on their feathers. And you breed those over breeding the others. And in generation 2, you will, assuming that this white coloration is due to genetics, which it is, in the next generation, you'll have a population of pigeons that are a bit whiter on average. Why? Because you chose the whitest ones last time and you bred them and they produced offspring like that. And then you do the same thing in generation 2. You choose the whitest ones among those birds. And maybe in generation 3, you get something like this. And you do this generation after generation after generation. And generation N means just some number of generations in the future. You may end up with this snow white version. And if you wanted to breed for that beautiful black plumage, you do the same thing, except every generation you choose for the birds that have the most black color on their feathers. The same process is applied to behavior. How do you get homing pigeons? How do you get tumbler pigeons that tumble over themselves as they fly? Well, every generation you choose the ones that are best at flying away and coming back, or turning over as they fly. And at the end of many, many generations, you have homing pigeons or tumbling pigeons. We do this, we've done this for virtually everything that we would call pets or livestock. So all these doggy breeds, all are descended from wolves. Every one of them is. How? Right? Eventually, as evolution was acting on wolves that were interacting with humans more and more, they became less and less fearful of us. We began to preferentially breed different groups to do different things. We might breed some varieties to hunt, some varieties just for companionship, other varieties for protection, and so on. And you can end up with this. This process of artificial selection, this is what puts stuff on the table for you. We have bred not just cattle and pigs and goats and anything that you might eat. That's the result of artificial selection. Cattle is descended from an ancestral cattle-like species, and we've chosen the things that we want in modern-day cattle. We've done this for breeding grains for the last 11,000 years. Right? Each generation, you choose, for example, the hardiest grains, the quickest growing, the most productive, the best tasting, on and on and on. Artificial selection, but on plants. And Darwin lays all of this out. And everybody in Victorian England, from farmers to pigeon breeders, would know this. They do it. That's what they do. In fact, in The Origin of Species, Darwin talks about the evolution of strawberries, which are descended from this piddly little red fruit here that isn't particularly tasty, but that over thousands of years, our ancestors have been choosing the tastiest, the quickest growing, and so on. And Darwin writes, as soon as gardeners picked out individual strawberry plants with slightly larger, earlier or better fruit and raised seedlings from them, and again picked out from the seedlings the ones that were best and bred them, the admirable characteristics that we now see in strawberries exist. And he's now just talking about some of the things that have happened in the last 30 or 40 years, but this has been going on for hundreds, probably thousands of years in strawberries. Okay, so that's artificial selection. That's what everybody knew. It's artificial because we, humans, are the ones that select this or that we want. What Darwin says is now recognize that what I'm talking about is the same thing, and the only difference is that instead of humans being the ones that select what works and what doesn't work, nature, the environment, selects. That's natural selection. That's where the natural in natural selection comes from. Darwin writes, man can only act on external and visible characters. Nature cares nothing for appearances, except insofar as if they are useful to any being. If being a fast runner is better than being a slow runner, then that's what matters. Doesn't matter what you look like when you run. If having long, thick fur makes you more attractive to the opposite sex than having thin, shorter fur, then that's what nature favors. Doesn't matter what it looks like to us, it matters whether or not it leads to the ability to produce more and more babies. Nature, she, can act on every internal organ, on every shade of constitutional differences, on the whole machinery of life. So after setting them up with artificial selection, he says, natural selection is the same thing. The only difference is instead of us picking this, that, and the other thing, nature does strictly on how well it makes the organism suited to its environment. That's natural selection. Okay, one more Darwin slide, one more quote, and then we go to the races in terms of modern studies of this. But this is such a powerful quote that I'm going to walk through it phrase by phrase. So in The Origin, Darwin writes about natural selection. It may be said that natural selection is daily and hourly scrutinizing throughout the world. So it's not a conscious this is nature favoring certain types over other types, right? It's not some conscious being doing this, it's this unconscious process. But the thing is that it's going on every moment of every day, everywhere. Then Darwin writes, every variation, even the slightest, right, rejecting that which is bad and preserving and adding up all that's good. Again, right, let me go back. Bad means a mismatch to the environment. Good means a good match to the environment, the ability to produce more and more offspring. So selection rejects that which doesn't fine-tune the organism better to the environment, and it preserves those things that do and increases those things over time. Natural selection silently and insensibly working whenever and wherever opportunity offers at the improvement of each organic being in relation to its organic, living, inorganic, abiotic conditions of life. Now, the last bit of this is sort of interesting. Darwin writes, we see nothing of these slow changes in progress until the hand of time has marked the long lapse of ages. So selection for many traits has been going on for thousands of years. And we weren't watching it happen over thousands of years. We see the results. Right? And it takes a long time, generally, for these traits, characteristics, to evolve by natural selection, until the hands of time has marked the long lapse of the ages. It turns out, and we're going to go through a nice example of this, that Darwin underestimated the process of natural selection. That we can, in fact, in real time, watch natural selection operate. And we'll go through a great example of that just in a couple of minutes. All right. So this process of natural selection basically occurs whenever the following things are in place. Pick a characteristic that you want to study and understand, whatever it might be. There has to be variation in that. There has to be some types that are like this, some types that are like that, some types that are different. That variation has to translate into what's known as differential reproductive success or fitness differences. And all that we mean by this is, let's say you have red, white, and black fur coloration. That gives you variation. Fitness differences mean that what you need is for natural selection to operate. It has to be true that one of those color types reproduces more than the other. You need to have that for natural selection to operate. And then finally, you have to have some way that this characteristic is passed down from one generation to the next. You have to have some kind of inheritance. As long as those things are in place, natural selection operates. And what it produces are what are known as adaptations. A trait is an adaptation if it's been shaped by selection to serve the same function that it serves today to benefit the organism. This cactus is stock full of adaptations. It has sharp spines to deter predators. It has a waxy cuticle to prevent water loss. It has a shallow root system so it can collect water after infrequent rains. It has flowers to entice pollinators. It has this accordion-like structure to let the plant expand and contract with water availability, and so on. Those are all adaptations. They're the product of this process of natural selection, fine-tuning the organism to its environment. All right, so now let's take a look at some cases and case studies of natural selection. I'm going to show you 2 or 3 of my favorites. We'll see how much we get through. These are old field mice. And they're both old field mice. They're both part of the same species. And they've been studied by Hopi Hoekstra. She used to be at San Diego. She's now been at Harvard for a long time. And she's been studying natural selection in these old field mice. And the reason I kept using fur coloration before over and over was not because that's the only trait. There are thousands of traits. It's just the one that we're going to focus on in this case study. So I wanted to kind of get you ready for it. So what Hopi Hoekstra and our colleagues have done is studied natural selection on coat coloration in various populations of the old field mouse. Okay. So if you go out and study, and they're all over the place, particularly in the southeast, if you go out and you study them, in most places, they're uniformly dark. They have uniformly dark coloration like this. Okay. But on Santa Rosa Island off the coast of northern Florida and off a few other coastal spots around there, the same species, the individual old field mice have a much lighter coat color. They have all this white, and even on top, it's not as dark brown as in the other variety. But you only see these along the beaches and barrier islands and around there in Florida. So I said for natural selection to operate, we need to have variability in our trait. And our trait is coat coloration. Well, here's a map. And these are samples that Hopi and her team collected from all over. And I don't want you to worry about looking at every single one. I'm just going to focus. Here is a sample of 40 coat colors from Santa Rosa Island beach mice over here. See how light colored on average they are. Over inland, right, they are very, very dark. So we have variation there. And then if you just do a kind of quick scan, you can see a lot more variation. It's not only really, really white or really, really brown. There's all sorts of variation. So we have variation. Now I said for natural selection to operate, it has to be true that like if you're a dark-colored mouse, you produce dark-colored babies. And if you're a light-colored mouse, you produce light-colored babies. That has to be in place for natural selection to operate. If it isn't, then everything sort of gets wiped out at the end of every generation. But if that characteristic is passed down, then selection can operate. And there's lots of ways that you could study this inheritance. One way is by actually identifying the genetic systems that underlie light versus dark coloration. And that's what they did. And they've identified several genes that are responsible for much of the variation that you see in coat color. And the most important one, and the one we're going to focus on now, just has this name, the MCR1 gene. This is a gene that's really important in understanding the genetics of coloration. The interesting thing is that this MCR1 gene doesn't just determine coloration in old field mice. It determines coloration in hundreds of mammalian species. And the same gene, or the bird equivalent of it, determines plumage coloration in birds. So this is a really important gene in terms of understanding coat coloration or even fur. All right, so here's the way this system works. And again, I know this might look a little intimidating. We're going to walk through this very, very slowly so we can see how does this translate? Like, how do you get from having a gene to having one coat color or the other? All right. So this MCR1 gene, it controls the pigments that are incorporated into the mouse's fur. And here's the way it works. There are these hormones floating around, and here's one that just has this fancy name of alpha MSH. But all you have to remember is that these brown circles are hormones that are floating around. Okay? This squiggly thing is a structure that's produced by the MCR1 gene. And it has a little receptor here, meaning that something can bind to it. Something can go in there and dock. If this brown hormone molecule docks here, what it does is it produces eumelanin. Eumelanin is a chemical that leads to dark fur. So if you have one of these molecules binding to the MCR1 little dock station there, you get dark coloration. That's what I just showed you. Now, if nothing docks here, then what happens, if nothing docks there, you get the production of what's known as pheomelanin. And pheomelanin is a compound that leads to light coloration. Okay, so now you understand just a little bit about sort of the molecular genetics. Now here's why that's important. What Hoekstra and her group have done is show two different mutations in the beach populations where the mice are really light that led to that light coloration. So we know from other studies that the dark variety of the mouse was the one that was first there. The white variety has evolved from a change, from mutation. Hoekstra and her team have not found one, but they found two different mutations that take the mice on the light islands and made them light colored. All right, so there's what we looked at before, okay? Now I'm going to show you the two mutations and how they work. So in one mutation, the receptor is broken. So let's go back up here. Now, this thing can't bind to it because it's not the right dock shape. If nothing binds to that, what do you get? You get this, which produces light coloration. So MSH can't bind, light color is produced. That's what happened on some islands thousands of years ago, that mutation appeared. On other islands, something different happened to produce light-colored mice, a different mutation. This time, what happened was there was another gene in the story, and it produced, and a mutation at that other gene produced lots of a new substance called ASP. And ASP is the same shape as the brown molecules that we talked about before. So it can bind to the receptor. And the mutation that produced tons of these ASP molecules that are floating around, which means that they're the ones that tend to dock in the receptor. But if anything, besides the brown ones dock there, you get light coloration. And so this is a second way that we understand the genetics, the inheritance system of light and dark-colored mice on these different islands. Now, we're going to talk about that third thing, fitness differences. Does one of these types outproduce the other type? Will natural selection favor one type in some environments and another type in different environments? And my guess is you can intuit how this is going to kind of work. So we're going to measure the fitness of the trait, and that's just the expected reproductive success of an individual that has it. Okay? So, the first study to look at fitness differences in the old field mice did this. The owls are predators of the old field mice. And what this researcher did was they had a large kind of aviary, maybe the size of this stage. And in there, they had an owl that could perch up there. And they had these 3 different microenvironments. This microenvironment is sort of the dark environment that you tend to see inland. And this is where you tend to see dark-colored mice. Another environment in there was a light-colored beach-like environment. This is where you tend to see light-colored mice. And this third environment was beach-colored, but it tended to have a little bit more vegetation that was more like the environment that you usually see the brown ones in. And what the investigator did was they took a light-colored mouse and a dark-colored mouse, and they put them on each of these microenvironments. They came back the next day, and they saw who was still alive and who wasn't. Oh, and so what you see here are the percentages. Now so in this case, on the dark environment, the probability of being captured by the predator was way lower for the dark than the light. And the reason these don't add to 100, they don't add up to 100, is simply because sometimes the owl didn't catch anything. Okay, so, but what's important is this is 75% greater than this, meaning that these guys are getting captured and eaten a lot. So this is a fitness difference. If you're brown, in the brownish environment, you do better than the white ones. Go over to the beach and you see the exact opposite. Now the probability of getting captured is way higher if you're dark-colored than you are light-colored. Fitness differences, they out-reproduce them. That's why we see light mice today on the islands. And then finally, this is just this kind of mixed environment, but it's beachy mostly. And so what you can see when you look at the numbers here is they're not as high. All that means is the owl had trouble catching anything. But when it did, the probability of being captured was twice as high if you were dark than if you were light. So again, on a beach environment, selection favors that. So variation, fitness differences, and inheritance. They're all in place here, and they explain to us why, if you go to Santa Rosa Island, you see mice with white fur, and if you go inland, you see mice with dark fur. Natural selection has been operating in those environments. Now, again, I knocked my thing out of my ear, but no, I'm okay, I can do it. Just hang on. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through just a bit more on this example, and then I want to do one more, and then so I want to leave at least 20 minutes for questions. I'm not sure if this. Can you hear me? Okay. Now that's better. Okay, got it. Okay, I can hear that. All right. So one last twist to the story here, and this is, I think it's important because sometimes people think evolutionary biologists are tracking these things in the past, and how do we know nobody was there 3 million years ago, all those kinds of things. But how do we know? We're very, very careful when we do these experiments to rule out alternative explanations, right? So I showed you this, and I said, all of this, it's really consistent with the idea that if your fur matches the background, selection favors you. So here it favors light, here it favors dark. But there's a bit of a problem. Right? Even though it's consistent with that explanation, what if the dark mice just behave differently in the dark environment than the white mice behave there? And what if the white mice behave differently in the light environment? We don't know, because all this guy did was put the owl in there, okay, and come back and see who was alive at the end of the night. So maybe behavior explains this, and it doesn't have anything to do with color. It's unlikely, but it's possible. So what Hoekstra and her team did was a really nifty little follow-up experiment. Okay, so here's an area that's a beach population, and what you generally find here are the light ones. And here's an area up here that's an inland population, it's dark, and what you generally find are the dark ones. So what did they do? They used a 3D printer, and they created little light mice and little dark mice, molds. So obviously, and they look exactly like the mice, but obviously they're not doing any sorts of behavior at all. They're just clay molds. So what they did was they put out the light-colored clay mold on the beach and the dark-colored clay mold on the beach, and the light-colored here and the dark-colored here. And then they came back periodically to see which of those things was still there. If it was still there, a predator didn't take it. If it was gone, the assumption was a predator grabbed it and probably dropped it off somewhere later when it realized what it was. But it wasn't just whether it was there or not that they could use to test their idea. They could also see talon and beak marks. So they could see, even if a predator came and didn't take anything, they could see which one did it go to and try and move to first, even if it didn't take it. All this graph is showing you is that the proportion of attacks on the light mice in the light environment were dramatically less than the proportion of attacks on the dark mouse in the light environment. And conversely, if you were light here, you didn't do well. If you were dark here, you did. So now we've removed behavior, still see those differences, stronger evidence that it is, in fact, natural selection acting on coat coloration. All right, so wait a minute. I am going to skip this. All right, so I actually had, this is good, I had 3 times as much material as I thought I'd be able to get through tonight, but this is an experiment I really want to walk us through. This is the one where I said Darwin underestimated the process of the speed at which natural selection could operate, that he thought it could only be seen over the lapse of ages. In fact, we can see it over real time. I want to talk to you about one of the most famous experiments that's been done in evolution for the last 50 years. And I'm going to start out by posing a thought experiment for you. Okay? Right. Imagine you're an evolutionary biologist and you have superhuman powers to do anything you want to test your ideas. Suppose that those superhuman powers allowed you to watch tens of thousands of generations of evolution take place in front of your eyes over a few years. Suppose you had the power to manipulate everything about the non-living part of the environment, the temperature, the salinity, everything to micro details. You could control the amount of food. You could control temperature. You can control spatial structure. Right? Suppose you could also manipulate anything about the living environment. You could add or remove predators, competitors, parasites. These are superhuman powers that we're going to give each other as a thought experiment. Suppose, in addition, you could have 12 parallel universes that all start off exactly the same, and you can watch evolution take place separately in each one of those. Suppose, since we're giving ourselves superpowers, that you could move your organisms around in a time machine so that they could compete against their ancestors or their descendants. Suppose you could stop evolution at any time and rerun it from the starting point. And suppose you knew everything about the genes of the organism you're looking at and everything about what translates into high reproductive success. This is, in fact, exactly the system that this fellow, Rich Lenski, and his colleagues built to study evolution and natural selection in real time. They have been tracking evolutionary change in E. coli cells for 70,000 generations. Just to put that into perspective, that's more generations than modern humans have existed for. So let's kind of walk through what is not really a thought experiment, that it's a system that Lenski set up to study natural selection. And he started almost 36 years ago. And the way that he started was he had these 12 vials, and every one of them was seeded with the exact same strain of bacteria. Okay? And these 12 populations are always kept separate from one another. These are the 12 parallel universes that Lenski created. He's going to watch evolution occur in all of them. And remember, the starting condition is exactly the same in every one of them. The only thing that was different was that the bacteria in here versus here versus here, each one of the bottles, the bacteria had what's known as a marker gene. And all that matters about a marker gene is it's something that doesn't affect anything about the bacteria, but it does allow you to identify that it's from this universe versus that universe versus that universe. It's just a way to double make sure that you never have mixing, unless for some sub-experiment you want it, then you know these cells are from universe 1, those cells are from universe 2. But for what we're going to talk about, the universes are kept separate. All right, so what do they do? Every day for the last 36 years, researchers transfer cells from each of these 12 lines, each of these 12 universes, into fresh growth media. In other words, so that they grow in each one of these 12, down here from 1 to 12. They grow overnight, and the next day they're taken out and put into fresh media, meaning a fresh liquid that has all the stuff they need to live and survive. And they do this every single night. Periodically, what they will do is grab a sample of cells from each of the 12 universes and stick them into a minus 80-degree freezer, where literally it puts those E. coli into suspended animation. When they're unfrozen, they're perfectly happy. When they're in the minus 80 freezer, they're essentially in suspended animation. So what he has then is these 12 lines that have been in operation for these 36 years. Now, E. coli can reproduce 6 to 7 generations overnight. So if you take those 6 to 7 generations over 34 years, which is 13,000 days, you get 70-something thousand generations. And the experiment is still going on today, although Lenski has finally passed it on to a colleague at another university. Okay, so what can you do with this? Well, I mean, endless things, which is what they've done. But one question you might want to ask if you're interested in natural selection, you could ask, would you see the same thing evolve over and over again in these different universes? Are there certain traits that no matter what, they're always favored in these bacteria? It's hard to know that if you have one world, one universe. But if you have 12 of these that are all started at the same exact point, you can ask, do we see the same traits evolving independently in each of these 12 universes? Everything is exactly the same. So they're in the vials, and every night the growth media where they live is changed so that it's fresh. And then the only other thing that's being done is periodically they go in and they grab some and they put them in the minus 80 freezer. So you could ask, well, would you see the same kind of things keep popping up over and over, or would you see something completely different in every one of these universes? So Lenski and his colleague, Michael Travisano, for this experiment, decided to ask that question, and here's what they did. They compared these 12 universes, and what they used as their characteristic of interest was something that was really easy for them to measure, which was the size of the cell. Right? And what they wanted to know was, did cell size change in the same direction in every one of these universes And if so, why? So cell size, again, it's really nice. You have the equipment, you can measure it to pinpoint detail. So here is one of the 12 universes. Here are the results from the first 10,000 generations. And it was during the first 10,000 generations that cell size changed dramatically. And what you see, cell volume is just our measure of cell size, is that in this universe, the size of the cell by cell volume doubled over the first 10,000 generations. That's a big change in the size of an organism. So the question is sort of why, right? I mean, if you're thinking about natural selection, you would hypothesize that the reason you see this is that larger size allows the cells to outcompete smaller cells. So remember that what they did was every 500 generations, I didn't say the exact number before, every 500 generations, they grab some, they put them in a -80 freezer, right? Cells are thawed, and they're competed against their descendants to see whether the descendants had higher fitness, had higher reproductive success. So what you're looking at here now, again, is those 10,000 generations. This graph is showing you relative fitness. That is, if you compete ancestors from the past against their descendants, what you see is the descendants have higher fitness. And so what's happening is the relative fitness of the larger size is being depicted here. What we're seeing from those competitions is that the descendants, which are larger, because I showed you that over time they get bigger, if you compete them against their ancestors, which are smaller, the larger descendants outcompete those smaller ancestors. So you know, in fact, that the reason that large size is being selected is because it allows you to outcompete small size, because you compete a generation against its ancestor from 500 or 1,000 generations ago, it does better because it's larger. Of course, there are other things that are going on too, but that's the main one. Okay, so great, that's one generation, one universe. Those are the two graphs I showed you. Here's the size, here's relative fitness. Right? Now we can ask, well, selection favored in that universe, but maybe quirky things happened in the other ones where it didn't favor that in the other universes. We don't know until we do it. So now, each one of these colored or dashed lines represents a different universe. And here's the 10,000 generations, and here's size. So what you can see is, in every one of the 12 universes, size increased over those 10,000 generations. It wasn't just that universe 1 that I showed you, it was all 12. What's really fascinating is that even though size increased in every one of them, it didn't increase in exactly the same way, in the sense that in this bottom red line here, the size went up from 0.4 to 0.7, but in the top line, it went up from 0.4 to 1.2 or 1.1. It almost tripled. So what this shows you is that selection is operating for larger size in all of the universes, but there are all sorts of complex things going on in these universes that determine why that affect why sometimes cell size goes up a huge amount and sometimes cell size goes up a little amount. It might depend on when different genetic mutations occur in the different universes. It may be that certain genetic mutations really facilitate cell growth and others facilitate it a little bit. But the key thing is it always goes up, but sometimes dramatically and sometimes not so dramatically, but still a lot. And this is just the same graph for relative fitness. And all this is showing you is that if you go to every one of those universes and you compete individuals against their ancestors, so the individuals are going to be larger than their ancestors, in every one of the universes, they outcompete their smaller ancestors. So natural selection is favoring larger size in every one of these universes. But life in these universes is complex, and it's not giving you the exact same result, but it's giving you the same general pattern. So this is the kind of power that you have when you work in these systems like E. coli bacterial systems, single-celled systems. You can study these things in real time. Right? You can study them in field mice, and you can do great work there. You can bring a system into the lab with E. coli, and you can do great work there. And there are just endless examples of these kinds of studies that are in the literature. And as I say, I was going to walk through a few others, but I really think it's important that I leave us some time to do this. And if you would like the PowerPoints for this, just drop me an email. You can see my name. Okay. So you can see the other examples that I didn't have time to work through, including there's this large area of research that's emerged over the last 20 years or so, where people have been studying what's known as anthropogenic evolution, which just means studying how the changes we make to the environment dramatically change how evolution operates on other organisms. And a friend and colleague of mine, a Dutch colleague, wrote a book on this that's over there. You can take out. It's called Darwin in the City, or Darwin Comes to Town, something like that, where it's studying evolution and natural selection, but in city environments. What happens when we create this completely different landscape for animals that have evolved out in the wild? People are beginning to study that. And there's just so much more that we could do, but I think I'm going to stop. And next time what we'll do is we'll move on to the question of, how can we explain the fact that there are millions and millions of different kinds of species? How can we explain the fact that we're also losing species at an alarming rate? So how can we understand speciation and extinction? So I will just now happily open the floor to any questions you might have. Yes. Yes. They are genetically identical. The only difference, again, is this little thing called a marker gene, and it doesn't affect anything about their abilities to do anything. It's just a way to know that they came from universe 1 versus universe 2 versus universe 3. Yeah. So in other words, if everything is exactly the same, why is it that in some populations we have size, let's say, go up 50%, but in one universe we have it go up 50%, but in another universe it might triple, right? That's what you're wanting to know? Yeah. Right. So the bacteria start off and they're all genetically identical in all the universes, right? But as soon as they start reproducing, mutations occur. Changes to the genetics of the cells occur. Mutations happen all of the time, but they're just essentially genetic mistakes. They're okay, right? But I actually cut out a series of slides on this specific question. So most mutations that occur have a negative effect on organisms. A slight percentage have a positive effect, and those are the ones that natural selection favors. So imagine you've got these 12 universes, and there are different mutations happening in different universes. And so maybe mutation 1 happens first here, and mutation 6 happens first here, or mutation A happens in universe 1, mutation B happens in universe 2, and so on. Those mutations are slightly different. Maybe one of them produces a little bit bigger cell than the other mutation does. And then other mutations build on top of that. And the way that those are built on are going to be different in every one of the universes as well. And so it's that building up of the differences in genetics that is explaining why, even though they all get bigger, they get bigger at different rates. The production of mutations is random. It happens by chance. Some of them will lead to bigger cell size. Some of them will lead to really bigger cell size. That might happen in this population, and that might happen in that population. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah.
I have a question. Is there always a mutation, no matter what? saying? So like if in universe 1, the first one is then A, is there always one, or could A be the exact same as universe 1, and then maybe the subset of B might have a couple of mutations, and then C might just be exactly like A? Is it a given genetically that there's always, or does biology say there's always a mutation, positive or negative?
Right. So yes, but I need to kind of parse the question a little bit. Okay. So at one level, the question is, are there always mutations? Is there every
One generation to the next.
right? Yes.
It's a given in biology. It's a given in evolution.
It's not a given in the sense that it must occur. It is a given in the sense that it does occur. If you look at any organism from one generation to the next, there will be some level of mutation. In some organisms, that rate will be higher. In other organisms, it'll be lower. The second part of your question, if I understand it right, was, can we have mutation A happen in universe 1, and then mutation B happen in universe 2, and then mutation A happen again in a different universe? Oh, okay. Well, so the end, okay, good. All right, well then, okay. Okay, it is a good question, so let me answer that. Yeah, so the answer is that in principle, it could. And basically, there are many different forms of mutation. Some are very simple. And without getting into kind of molecular genetics, it's a little bit hard to describe it, but imagine that one kind of mutation just replaces one teeny little bit with a different teeny bit. Other mutations involve moving a big chunk of a chromosome from one spot to the other. When you're looking at the mutations that are very, very simple, it's possible that you could have the same mutation appear in different populations. Yes?
It's not clear to me why size and coli is advantage. And it seems like it's
Yeah. So the question was, well, why should size matter in E. coli? And here I have to basically say, I don't know E. coli well enough to answer that question. Okay, but in a sense, it doesn't matter that I don't know that, because the fact that when I compete an individual against its ancestor that was smaller, I always see them out competing, then that strongly suggests that size is important. Yes, other things are changing over time as well, but if I was an E. coli biologist, I can explain why size is really important. I just know that it is, but I don't know the mechanism of how. Well, they're not infecting anything here. So
I just meant in general. Does that have to do with that or not?
it could, but again, so I don't know that being larger would have, for example, any effect on infection. I don't know if that. It's a very complicated question. Yeah. Let me just go back here for 1 second. Yeah.
I don't know if I'm going to articulate this well. Go back to when Darwin was talking about how pigeons were breeding overbred over and over the generations. Were there anybody, well, I know that in some cases I would imagine that would introduce recessive genes that you don't know, that may pop up as unusual. Like, for instance, in human populations in the embryo, you have something that pops up in the perspective. Was that well? We have to talk about that?
No, well, these are all good questions. They're somewhat complicated questions, but I'll try to give you a nutshell answer. So basically, in the case of the pigeons and in general, as an evolutionary biologist, if you're doing these kinds of experiments, what you want to have is a fairly large population of individuals to work with. And when you have a large population of individuals to work with, then when you do your breeding, you can avoid breeding relatives. It is true that if an individual has white, it's likely that their brother or their cousin also does if it's a genetic trait. But you try to design your experiments so that you have a big enough population that you don't breed relatives, because there are inbreeding problems. Inbreeding usually causes problems. It doesn't always. Sometimes it actually has a positive effect. I'm not talking about in humans. I'm talking about what we know from other organisms. And I'm not encouraging it. Yes. Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily have to have an objective to change. I mean, if they got bigger, or maybe they got bigger for no particular reason. Just like people will get bigger if they're given every food and drink that they want. I mean, it doesn't mean that there's an objective. It just means it's what happens.
These are all great questions that require me to parse them out, because you're asking me two really good questions. Absolutely not, right? So this is not any kind of conscious process. The organisms are not attempting to do anything. Okay. No. But see, in the case of the cells getting bigger, and your example, it is true that if in some of the universes you gave them better things to eat, they would be bigger than the cells in the other one. But here, that's not the case. They're all getting the same thing. And it's only the bigger ones that are able to outcompete the smaller ones. That does tell us, even though there's no conscious process going on, that natural selection is favoring larger cells. Yes, you can get bigger for other reasons, but here what's happening is because of genetic change, they're getting larger and larger. But there absolutely is no conscious objective, except like in the artificial selection experiment where I gave you, where there always is, because we're doing it. Yes?
So, in terms of the artificial selection stuff, I guess I have a multi-layered question, which apparently...
Great!
And you may touch on this later in the course, but where does things like extinction come in? Because I think of, artificial selection going from some sort of rock pigeon to a very, very adept passenger pigeon, and then sometime in the early 1900s when the last passenger pigeon died. Like, could we not, as humans, continue to artificially select pigeons to recreate a species? So, like, where's the line between species and breeding?
So this is something that Darwin spent an inordinate amount of time discussing, the distinction between populations and species, for example. And so we will, next time, really dig into what do we mean as an evolutionary biologist when we mean this thing is species 1 and this thing is species 2, okay? We will also talk about things that might make species 1 or species 2 go extinct. Unfortunately, we won't have a time, and it's out of my area of expertise, but there certainly are many, many people that are interested in what you might think of as sort of evolutionary reconstructions. But we're just not going to be able to get into that. I could probably find you some good reading material for it. Yes?
Were there other characteristics that they observed in size that came from this generation?
So there were other characteristics that they observed. For example, the ability to handle certain toxins in the environment. So they could introduce, if they have universe 1, I'm calling it universe 1 because it's in this big dish, right? But they could take out different parts of it, and they could look at exposing it to various toxins or predators or different competitors. And yes, you get all kinds of different traits evolving. I just focused on cell size here because it was sort of one that you can wrap your mind around. But yes, absolutely. I didn't mean to make it sound like this was the only thing that happened. It's never like, that's never the way it goes, yeah.
So I can sleep tonight? What level of security do they have around these?
E. coli are so they, I don't, well, okay. I mean, they're they're giant, they're larger E. coli than others in the universe. I don't know. So I'm guessing that in fact, so there are all sorts of biohazard levels associated with laboratories, and I don't think E. coli is actually considered all that dangerous compared to things that need to be protected against. And these guys are super good. I don't know the details of how they protect, but I guarantee you these cells are not getting out into the environment. And in fact, if they did, my guess is they snipped out the bits of the genome that make them dangerous to humans, which is very easy to do in a controlled environment. So sleep well. Okay, maybe I'll take one more and then, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Is there statistical analysis of controlled environments? You know, it's just, I mean, you see this huge difference. I mean, is that statistically significant?
Yeah, I spared you the statistics, but the answer is yes. Yeah, the answer is yes, but I've spared you standard error bars and all of that for most of the talk, for most of the things I'm discussing. But if I talk about the differences, I mean statistically significant differences. All right, well, thank you. Oh, well, I'll take one more.
Maybe off the wall, but I think twice I've heard you say this is not consciousness. Now, isn't there some kind of consciousness that's at work there? Not the kind of consciousness that we have.
Well, when I say there's no consciousness, what I mean is that the process of natural selection is not a conscious process. I'm not saying that there aren't other organisms, primates, even certainly birds, other things that may have what we consider cognitive abilities and consciousness in the sense that we describe them in our cells. That's a different topic altogether. Other organisms may be conscious of themselves. There is work that suggests that they are. They're conscious of their environment. What I'm saying is this process of natural selection, it's a process. There's no agent besides nature that's going in and saying, I want this, that, and the other thing. That's what I mean. Yeah. All right, well, thank you again for coming out. And